It has been 20 years since American and coalition forces invaded Iraq on a mission to topple Saddam Hussein's dictatorship and to find those weapons of mass destruction. Within 3 weeks, Saddam's regime had fallen, but no stockpiles of nuclear or chemical or biological weapons were ever found. By the time U.S. troops left in 2011, the insurgency that followed the invasion had claimed the lives of more than 100,000 Iraqi civilians, while U.S. losses had reached nearly 4,500. Now, a semblance of normalcy has returned, but Iraq still battles a range of challenges, from political instability to poverty and rampant corruption. Our next report takes a look at today's Iraq.
Shock and awe. The Iraq War started with a barrage, explosions lighting up Baghdad on the banks of the Tigris River by night. Soon, U.S. troops were moving into the city, and they intended to topple dictator Saddam Hussein in a very literal way. This is that same square 20 years later, bustling with traffic, modern hotels, and fountains. The city is a far cry from the war-torn place that the name Baghdad evokes after more than a decade of sectarian violence that killed tens of thousands. But despite the relative peace of recent years, many are still troubled.
Currently, the situation is the same. There's no difference between the current regime and the previous one. When you want to speak or demand your rights, they confront you with weapons and killing. It's no different from the previous regime. We assumed that Iraq got rid of the tyrant Saddam Hussein and the country would be in better shape, but it was one tragedy after another. Saddam is gone, but we got 1,000 other Saddams.
But not everyone feels despair.
I
have faith that the youth are the ones who come up with the ideas. The youth are the ones who lead the revolution. The youth are the foundation, and the best proof of that is the protests that happened in 2019. We saw the youth lead the protests. That gave me a bit of hope.
Baghdad still suffers from widespread poverty, despite Iraq's great oil wealth. Before, it was stolen by Saddam Hussein. Now, the oil money still doesn't make it into regular people's pockets.
Iraq is still the same, and nothing has changed. Citizens hoped for something better, but there's no change.
There's no more shock and awe, just a widespread feeling that things could have, and should have, gone much better.
Yeah, 2 decades have gone by quickly. We want to take a look back now at the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq and its effects with Middle East analyst Daniel Gerlach. Daniel, it's good to see you again. We've talked many times about the situation in Iraq post-invasion. 20 years after the beginning of the invasion, what are the geopolitical consequences that we're dealing with today?
Well, the geopolitical consequences were dramatic. First of all, by invading Iraq, of course, America strengthened its arch-enemy, Iran, because Iran has become a heavyweight in the region.
That's because Iraq has become weaker, right?
Of course, because Saddam Hussein was the opponent of Iran, and for that reason was supported by the West for a long time before the fortune turned. Israel also became much more powerful because, of course, Saddam Hussein was one of the arch rivals and a threat to Israel's security interest. And the American-led coalition invasion weakened the Arab camp, and it led to instability and at the same time, lack of modernization also in the Arab world. Arab rulers, Arab dictators were weakened, but remained in the status quo for a long time. And I think you can say that the Arab Spring, almost a decade later, happened because there was no change, no reform, and promises were not kept. And that is also one of the consequences of the war on terror, but also of the Iraq invasion.
You haven't mentioned Islamic State, ISIS.
Well, that is a very complicated issue. Of course, you hear that a lot in the region. The American invasion led to the creation of ISIS, or even the shortcut. People were saying the Americans created
right.
ISIS. I think that is much more complicated. We saw these tendencies of jihadism and extremism long before. The destabilization and disintegration of states in the region, which was also a major factor. And I think that is one of the products that eventually led to the creation of the so-called Islamic State in Iraq. Look, the point is the war, the invasion itself was difficult, and it left like devastation in Iraq. But what happened after the war, the civil war that this invasion entailed, was much more destructive, and it led to a sectarian strife, and that was the ultimate fuel that also led to the creation of the Islamic State in Iraq, which was some sort of a Sunni insurrection against the Americans, against the Shia leaders. And so, yes, you can say that the creation of ISIL was also one of the long-term consequences of the invasion.
Well, can you say, had there been no invasion of Iraq, there would have been no Islamic State?
Well, that is quite possible, but we don't know, of course, that's an academic speculation. We don't know how stable the regime of Saddam Hussein would have been. We know that he already, though he was often like branded a secular Arab powerful leader, he also played with the mobilization fuel of Islam, and especially to the end of his rule, he became some sort of an Islamist, you can say. He was supporting Arab and Islamist and Sunni sentiment at the same time. He was doing like some sort of an Islamization campaign, and he also supported, let's say, Sunni sectarian ideas. So you can say that the ideology was there before, but of course, without the disintegration, the downfall of the regime, it's quite hard to imagine that militias turning into pseudo-states, like controlling vast areas of lands in Iraq, would just like pop up like this. No, Saddam Hussein would have certainly controlled that.
We were talking in the newsroom this evening that we were surprised that in the United States, there hasn't been a lot of public discussion, reporting on the 20th anniversary of this invasion. We're surprised by that. Are you, and do you have an answer if someone were to say, why did the Americans invade Iraq today?
It's very difficult from today's perspective with hindsight to imagine such a situation even, that a Western democratic country would take such a decision. Look, I think back then, of course, I don't want to go into the psychology of the Republican leadership at that time, George W. Bush, but I think there was at the same time some sort of an arrogance, but also an optimism that the entire world is just there after the downfall of the Soviet Union, that the entire world is just there to embrace Western liberal democracy. And many Americans, though they had no real idea what was going on in Iraq, felt vindicated. Right after the downfall of the regime, there was some sort of a treacherous silence and peace. Iraqis didn't take up arms and fight the American invaders from the very first day. Of course, there was a time of silence, a couple of months, where many Americans said, okay, you see, the Iraqis want democracy. They were just happy that we ousted Saddam Hussein, and now let's build a new state. And the way that this new state was built was in a way very naive. But at the same time, what we see as a legacy is a deficient democracy, a parliamentary democracy. But if you compare to other states, and by no means I want to justify the American invasion, it was an absurd decision, but you see that there is a parliamentary democracy, and some Iraqis are proud of this, of the system, though they know it's deficient. And what I find most striking is that given the fact that the Americans created so much devastation in Iraq, I cannot say, and I travel the country quite frequently, that Iraqis are fundamentally anti-American. You find anti-American sentiment, but not more than elsewhere in the world.
What is their relationship then, to the United States? There's still somewhat of a military presence in the region, but how do you explain that then, that there is not this greater anti-Americanism?
Well, I think there was a lot of cultural influence, especially on the state-building process, especially on the political class. And even though the Iraqi politicians that I have met, and I have met many of them personally, many of the big power brokers in the country, they have remained some sort of an entente cordiale with the Americans. They have remained some sort of a relationship with the Americans because, of course, they know about the negative power. They know what America can do to you if you're not their friend. And this is quite, well, some people would call it a Stockholm syndrome. I think it's just like very cold calculus of interest. Iraqis have learned how to balance often we hear that they are influenced by Iran, or some even say that they are a proxy state of Iran. That is nonsense, I think. They very well know how to balance the power of America, of Iran, and of other regional players, but they at the same time welcome foreigners and even invite sometimes foreign powers to sit at the table and play a role in the country, which is quite an interesting thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Daniel Gerlach, as always, we appreciate your time. It's good to see you here in the studio again as well. Thank you.
Thank you for so much time.
Thank you. Sure.